The fluorescent lights of Parker's Market buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glow across the endless parade of customers. My fingers moved mechanically across the barcode scanner, each electronic beep serving as a metronome, marking another moment of my 41 years spent behind this same register, in this same checkout lane, wearing the same red polyester vest that had become as much a part of me as my own skin. The vest clung uncomfortably to my shoulders, faded from countless industrial washes that had stripped away not just the vibrant color, but somehow the dignity as well. It bore the ghostly outlines of name tags long since replaced, small rectangular shadows that told the story of promotions that never came, of recognition that remained perpetually just out of reach. My wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as I reached for another item, a simple gold band that had once symbolized forever, but now felt more like a shackle, binding me to promises that apparently only I had intended to keep. The woman standing before me struggled with two screaming toddlers, their voices cutting through the ambient noise of shopping carts and distant conversations. I offered her a sympathetic smile, the kind that came naturally after 18 years of customer service, when every human emotion had to be processed through the filter of professional courtesy. My earbuds sat snugly in my ears, a small rebellion against corporate policy. The music usually helped the hours pass more quickly, providing a soundtrack to the monotony that made each shift feel less like a prison sentence. But today, instead of music, my phone delivered a message that would shatter my world into irreparable pieces. "I'm going to find something better." Ryan's voice carried through the wireless signal with devastating clarity, each word precisely enunciated in the tone he used when discussing business matters. There was no emotion in his delivery, no suggestion that he was discussing the dissolution of a 12-year marriage rather than commenting on the weather. "I need someone who matches my future. I'm going to find something better." The words hung in the digital space between us, traveling through cell towers to deliver devastation with clinical precision. Not even the dignity of a face-to-face conversation, not even the courtesy of waiting until I came home from work, until we were in private. A voice message, delivered while I stood in my workplace, surrounded by customers who had their own problems to worry about, wearing the uniform that had become my second skin. My hand froze mid-scan, the barcode reader still clutched in my trembling fingers while the milk carton I'd been processing seemed to blur before my eyes. The scanner's red laser continued to sweep back and forth across the product, searching for the pattern that would translate into a price, but my fingers had gone numb and unresponsive. I rewound the message once, my thumb fumbling with the phone's controls. Surely I'd misheard something. Surely Ryan, who could be thoughtless but had never been deliberately cruel, hadn't actually ended our marriage via voicemail while I was at work, but the replay confirmed every devastating word. I tried again, and then a third time, hoping somehow the digital recording would change. But each repetition only hammered home the brutal truth. The man I'd loved, supported, and sacrificed for had discarded me with the same casual indifference he might show when deleting unwanted emails. "Ma'am?" The business suit man behind her carried the particular kind of irritation reserved for service workers who had the audacity to experience human emotions during business hours. "Is there a problem?" I looked up at him, this stranger whose biggest concern was whether his grocery shopping would make him late for whatever important meeting awaited him. I wanted to explain that my husband had just abandoned me via voicemail, that 12 years of marriage had been dismissed in 30 seconds of recorded audio. Instead, I managed a weak smile and resumed scanning his items. Organic vegetables that cost more than I spent on food in a week, imported cheese that probably represented half my daily wage, wine that I'd never be able to afford even for special occasions. Each beep of the scanner felt like a small death, another reminder of the vast gulf between my circumstances and those of the people I served. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of mechanical motions and forced pleasantries. I scanned barcodes, counted change, bagged groceries, and wished customers a pleasant day while my mind replayed Ryan's message on an endless loop. "I'm going to find something better." Beep. Another can of soup for someone else's dinner. "I need someone who matches my future." Beep. Another bottle of wine for someone else's celebration. Something cracked wide open in my chest, not my heart, for that implied something clean and sharp. This was messier, rawer, like the sound of old wood splintering under too much weight. I'd been carrying that weight for years without even realizing it, and now the entire architecture of my life was giving way all at once. Life continued its relentless march forward, while my universe collapsed inward, creating a singularity of pain right there in aisle 7, between the breakfast cereals and the cleaning supplies, where the industrial carpet bore the stains of countless spilled drinks and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. If you like emotional stories that touch the heart, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know you're there with me through this journey, because what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about love, sacrifice, and what it really means to find something better. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where I'd imagined living someday, past houses with manicured lawns and two-car garages, and windows that glowed with warm yellow light, suggesting the kind of domestic contentment I'd always assumed would eventually be mine. Every landmark along the familiar route now served as monuments to a life that had apparently been built on foundations of sand. The coffee shop where Ryan and I had our first date, nervously sharing a piece of chocolate cake while trying to impress each other with stories about our college experiences. The park where we'd walked Max on Sunday mornings, throwing tennis balls and pretending to be the kind of couple who had everything figured out. The restaurant where he'd proposed 7 years ago, getting down on one knee beside a table decorated with roses he'd somehow arranged to have waiting for us. Each memory felt contaminated now, poisoned by the knowledge that while I'd been treasuring these moments as evidence of our love's strength and permanence, Ryan had apparently been cataloging my inadequacies and planning his escape. How long had he been thinking about leaving? How many of our conversations had been his way of gathering ammunition for the eventual divorce proceedings? I'd grown up in a working-class family that believed in the power of persistence, in the idea that good things came to those who were willing to work hard and wait patiently for their rewards. My mother had drilled into me the virtues of loyalty and commitment, the importance of standing by your promises no matter how difficult circumstances became. Marriage isn't about finding someone perfect, she used to say while folding laundry in our small kitchen, the smell of detergent and fabric softener creating a backdrop to life lessons that seemed profound at the time. It's about choosing someone and then working together to build something beautiful. I'd carried those lessons into my relationship with Ryan, through his increasingly frequent complaints about our modest lifestyle, his pointed comments about my appearance that always began with, "I'm not trying to be mean," and ended with suggestions for improvements I couldn't afford to make. I'd endured his growing obsession with status and appearances, his way of introducing me to his colleagues that somehow managed to emphasize my job at the grocery store, while downplaying the fact that I'd been supporting our household just as much as he had. Ryan worked in finance, a fact he mentioned with the regularity of a man checking his pulse, as if his professional identity required constant confirmation to remain valid. His salary significantly exceeded mine, a disparity he referenced almost daily, not with pride in his success, but with a sort of weary disappointment, as if my inability to match his earnings was a personal failing rather than a simple economic reality. He spoke often about the promotions he deserved, the recognition that eluded him despite his obvious qualifications, the way our modest suburban home and my practical Honda Civic somehow reflected poorly on his professional image. When clients come to the house, he'd say, surveying our living room with the critical eye of someone evaluating a property for purchase, they need to see success. They need to trust that I know how to handle money because I obviously know how to make it. Despite earning significantly more than I did, Ryan had never been inclined to share his financial success in ways that might have improved our joint circumstances. "You've got your paycheck," he'd say whenever I suggested we might pool our resources for a vacation or a home improvement project, or even something as simple as dinner at a restaurant that didn't feature a dollar menu. Use that. And I had, stretching my grocery store wages to cover half the bills, all the food shopping, and whatever household needs arose that fell outside Ryan's definition of his financial responsibilities. I'd learned to be creative with coupons and store sales, to plan meals around whatever protein happened to be marked down for quick sale, to repair clothes and appliances rather than replacing them when newer models might have been more convenient. I'd even contributed to the down payment on our house, dipping into savings I'd accumulated since my 20th birthday. Money saved quarter by quarter during lean years when every dollar mattered, and entertainment meant checking books out of the library rather than going to movies. That contribution had been presented as a romantic gesture, a symbol of our partnership and shared commitment to building a future together. Now I realized it had simply been another way for Ryan to leverage my resources while maintaining complete control over his own. The house stood silent when I arrived, but it was a different kind of silence than I'd grown accustomed to over 12 years of marriage. This wasn't the quiet of an empty home waiting to be filled with conversation and laughter. This was the hollowness of a space that had been deliberately emptied, systematically stripped of everything that made it feel like a home, rather than just a building with rooms and walls and fixtures. The front door opened normally, my key turning in the lock with the same small clicking sound I'd heard thousands of times before. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something fundamental had changed. The air felt different, thinner somehow, as if someone had opened all the windows and let the essence of our shared life escape into the atmosphere. The leather sectional we'd saved for over 2 years, gone. I could see the indentations in the carpet where its legs had rested, small depressions that marked the ghost of furniture we'd chosen together during a weekend shopping trip that had felt like such an adult milestone. We'd sat on dozens of couches in the showroom, testing firmness and discussing color options like the decision actually mattered, like we were building something permanent together. The dining room set my parents had given us as a wedding gift vanished completely. The mahogany table where we'd eaten Christmas dinners and celebrated birthdays, where I'd paid bills and he'd worked on his laptop during evenings when the office followed him home, now existed only as a slightly lighter rectangle on the hardwood floor, where years of sunlight hadn't been able to reach. Even the coffee table I'd refinished myself during a long weekend project had disappeared. I'd spent hours sanding away years of wear and water stains, revealing the beautiful wood grain beneath layers of neglect. I'd researched the proper techniques, bought the right supplies, worked until my arms ached and my back protested from bending over for hours at a time. When I'd finally applied the final coat of polyurethane and stepped back to admire my work, Ryan had nodded approvingly and said it looked almost professional. The walls bore pale rectangles where pictures had hung, photographs from our honeymoon, framed prints we'd bought at art fairs, even the silly snapshot of us at a Halloween party 3 years ago when we'd dressed as a matching pair of playing cards. These ghostly marks served as an inventory of shared memories that had apparently meant more to me than to him, evidence of a life together that he'd been able to discard as easily as outdated calendar pages. In the bedroom, Ryan's walk-in closet yawned empty, the wooden hangers swaying slightly in the current from the air conditioning vent, like the remnants of a forest after a wildfire had swept through and consumed everything combustible. The built-in shelving that had once held his shoes and accessories now displayed only dust outlines and the occasional forgotten sock or tie clip that hadn't been deemed worthy of inclusion in his new life. My own clothes seemed lost and lonely on their side of the shared space, a visual representation of how I'd felt for months without consciously acknowledging it. Dresses hung with extra space between them now that his suits no longer pressed against them. My shoes looked scattered and insufficient on shelves that had once been perfectly organized to accommodate 2 people's footwear collections. The dresser drawers hung open, their contents ransacked and abandoned with the haste of someone who'd wanted to complete an unpleasant task as quickly as possible. His cologne bottles and grooming supplies had disappeared completely, leaving only the faint scent of his presence slowly fading into memory, mixing with the smell of furniture polish and the lavender sachets I'd tucked into corners to keep our clothes smelling fresh. But it was what I found on my laptop that truly revealed the scope of his betrayal. The savings account, our joint account that I'd foolishly trusted him to manage because he was better with numbers and understood investment strategies I'd never had the education to master, had been drained to the last dollar. Years of my careful contributions, every $20 and $50 bill I'd managed to squirrel away from my modest paychecks, all gone. The online banking statement showed a balance of $0.00, with a final withdrawal that had cleared that morning while I was scanning groceries and smiling at customers who were planning dinners I could no longer afford to cook. He'd taken everything, systematically and methodically, the way he approached every aspect of his professional life. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, scrolling through months of transactions that told the story of my own financial destruction. Small withdrawals at first, amounts I wouldn't have noticed if I'd been paying attention. Then larger sums, always with explanations about investment opportunities or emergency expenses that required immediate attention. I'd trusted him completely, never questioning the division of labor that left me responsible for immediate necessities while he managed our long-term financial security. The phone rang, cutting through my stunned silence like a blade. I answered without checking the caller ID, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Jennifer Walsh from First National Bank." The woman's tone was crisp, professional, and utterly without sympathy. "We've been trying to reach you regarding your mortgage account. According to our records, payments stopped in January, and we need to discuss your options immediately." I stared at the phone, certain there had been some mistake. Ryan handled our finances with the methodical precision he brought to his professional work. The automatic payments had been set up years ago. How could there be a problem? "There must be some confusion," I said, my voice higher and more desperate than I'd intended. "My husband handles our mortgage payments. He sets up automatic transfers from our account every month. According to our records, Mr. Morrison contacted us 3 months ago to remove his automatic payment authorization," Jennifer continued, her voice remaining neutral but somehow conveying implied criticism. "He indicated that you would be taking over responsibility for the account going forward. 3 months ago." Ryan had been planning his departure for months, systematically removing himself from our financial obligations, while allowing me to remain ignorant of the approaching disaster. What kind of wife didn't know her own husband had stopped paying their mortgage? I don't understand," I stammered, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs that Ryan had deemed unworthy of relocation. "I wasn't told about any changes to our account. I don't have access to the mortgage information. Everything is in his name. We'll need to see some kind of payment within the next 10 days, Jennifer Walsh continued, consulting whatever computer screen contained the details of my financial destruction. "Or we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. The amount due, including late fees and penalties, is $18,437. $18,000. More than my entire annual salary after taxes, more money than I'd ever had access to at one time in my adult life." The number hung in the air like a mathematical impossibility, a figure so far beyond my means that it might as well have been 18 million. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my empty kitchen and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. Not only had Ryan abandoned me, but he'd systematically destroyed my financial stability in the process. The house I'd helped pay for, the savings I'd contributed to, the credit I'd helped build, all of it was crumbling while he started fresh somewhere else with someone who matched his future. That's when I heard the scratching at the front door, a sound so familiar it took me a moment to register why it felt wrong. My heart leaped with desperate hope as I rushed to the entrance, thinking maybe Ryan had returned, maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But when I opened the door, I found only Max's leash hanging on the hook where I'd left it yesterday morning. The red nylon with reflective stitching, chosen specifically for our evening walks through the neighborhood when visibility mattered for safety. Max had learned to recognize the sound of me taking it down from its hook, the small metallic clink of the clasp that meant adventure was imminent. He'd dance around my feet while I attached it to his collar, his tail creating a percussion rhythm against furniture and walls, his joy so pure and simple that it had never failed to lift my spirits even on the worst days. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Max was gone too. My golden retriever, who'd been my constant companion through long shifts and difficult days, who'd greeted me at the door every evening with the kind of unconditional enthusiasm that made minimum wage work feel bearable, had been taken along with everything else Ryan had decided belonged to him. Ryan had taken Max not because he particularly enjoyed dog ownership. I'd been the one who fed him, walked him, cleaned up after him, and arranged for veterinary care, but because Max was an asset with monetary value, something that could be claimed and possessed and removed from my reach. I collapsed on the living room floor, the carpet rough against my palms as I struggled to process the magnitude of my abandonment. The house felt impossibly large around me, every room echoing with the absence of a life I'd thought was permanent. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, its motor the only sound in a space that had been stripped of its soul, its purpose, its reason for existing. The carpet showed indentations where furniture had rested for years, small archaeological evidence of a domestic life that had apparently been more fragile than I'd ever imagined. I traced one of these depressions with my finger, remembering how we'd argued about furniture placement when we'd first moved in. I'd wanted the couch facing the window so we could watch the seasons change in our backyard. He'd preferred it facing the television so we could watch the financial news while eating breakfast. We'd compromised, as married couples do, rotating the arrangement every few months until we'd found a configuration that satisfied both our preferences. Now I realized that every compromise I'd made had been a small surrender, every accommodation a step toward the moment when I'd wake up to discover that the person I'd been adjusting myself to please had decided I was still insufficient for his needs. That night, hunger drove me to the kitchen, where I discovered the final insult: 1 egg, half a bottle of ketchup, and a slice of stale bread. This was my inheritance from 12 years of marriage, the scraps left behind by a man who'd taken everything he deemed valuable and left me with the remnants. The refrigerator, which had once been filled with the ingredients for meals I'd planned and prepared for 2 people, now looked like the appliance of someone who'd given up on the basic act of nourishing herself. The shelves were bare except for condiments and the kinds of items that never seemed to get used up: pickle relish, soy sauce packets from Chinese takeout, a jar of maraschino cherries that had been there so long I couldn't remember what I'd originally intended to use them for. I cracked the egg into a pan that had seen better days, its non-stick coating worn away in patches that made cooking a small act of faith. The egg sizzled in oil I'd found in a cabinet, probably older than it should have been but still capable of preventing complete culinary disaster. I ate my meager dinner standing at the counter, too drained to sit at the kitchen table where Ryan and I had shared thousands of meals, too numb to cry over the irony that I, who had fed others for so many years, now found herself with barely enough food to sustain myself. The egg was overcooked, the yolk hard and dry, but it filled the gnawing emptiness in my stomach, even as it did nothing for the hollow ache in my chest. Sleep came fitfully that night on the bare mattress Ryan had apparently deemed unworthy of theft. The bed frame remained, but the expensive memory foam mattress that had been his contribution to our bedroom comfort had vanished along with everything else. I was left with the basic box spring and the thin backup mattress we'd kept in the guest room, a surface designed for occasional use rather than nightly rest. I curled into myself beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener, pulling my knees to my chest in the position that humans instinctively adopt when the world becomes too overwhelming to face upright. Every sound in the settling house made me jump. Was he coming back? Had he forgotten something else he wanted to claim as his own? But Ryan didn't return, and as the hours passed in the darkness, I began to understand with crystalline clarity that he never would. The voice message had been his goodbye, his dismissal, his final judgment on a woman he'd decided was insufficient for the future he envisioned for himself. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of devastating revelations. A week later, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox bearing the seal of the county court. Inside, documents printed on expensive paper and written in deliberately intimidating legal terminology informed me that I had 30 days to vacate the premises or face forced removal by law enforcement officials. Eviction. The word itself felt shameful, carrying connotations of failure and irresponsibility that I'd never associated with my own life. I'd always paid my bills, met my obligations, lived within my means with the careful attention to detail that people of limited resources learn to exercise as a matter of survival. Yet here I was, facing homelessness through no fault of my own. I read the documents 3 times, hoping to find some loophole, some avenue of appeal, some way to prove that this was all a terrible mistake. But the law was clear and unforgiving. When your name isn't on the deed and you can't make the payments, your residency becomes a privilege that can be revoked with proper legal notice. The final blow came the following Monday morning, when I arrived at Parker's Market for what I assumed would be another routine day of scanning barcodes and forcing smiles for customers who saw me as nothing more than a necessary inconvenience. Instead, I found myself called into Margaret Chen's office, that cramped space behind the customer service counter that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, furnished with the kind of aggressively uncomfortable chairs that discouraged employees from lingering during what were inevitably unpleasant conversations. Margaret had been my supervisor for 8 years, a practical woman in her 50s who ran the store with the efficiency of someone who understood that retail success depended on maintaining precise control over labor costs and inventory turnover. "Sit down, Becky," Margaret said, gesturing to the metal folding chair positioned across from her desk. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. We're downsizing. Corporate has decided to eliminate several full-time positions across all locations as part of a chain-wide cost reduction initiative. Since you've been here the longest, your severance package will be more substantial than what newer employees receive, but I'm afraid your position is being eliminated effective immediately. 18 years of loyal service, of showing up early and staying late, of covering shifts for sick colleagues and working through holidays when other people were home with their families, of maintaining a professional demeanor even when customers treated me with casual contempt. All of it reduced to a corporate decision made by people in offices hundreds of miles away who'd never learned my name or witnessed my dedication. Your final paycheck will include 2 weeks' severance pay," Margaret continued, sliding an envelope across the desk with mechanical precision. "I want you to know that this decision came from levels far above my authority. If it were up to me, you'd be the last person I'd ever consider letting go. 2 weeks' pay, $468 after taxes. Barely enough to buy groceries for a month under normal circumstances, let alone enough to secure new housing and survive until I could find another job." I cleaned out my locker in the employee break room, gathering the few personal items I'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades of working in the same building. A photo of Ryan and me from happier times, a small succulent plant that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that I'd grown fond of despite its imperfection. These meager possessions fit easily into a single plastic bag. The other employees avoided eye contact as I walked through the store for the last time, their discomfort palpable in the way they suddenly found urgent tasks that required their complete attention. I represented their own vulnerability, proof that loyalty and hard work offered no protection against the arbitrary cruelties of economic reality. Outside, the parking lot stretched before me like a desert of hot asphalt and abandoned shopping carts. My Honda Civic sat in the employee section where I'd parked it thousands of times before, faithful and unpretentious, the only thing in my life that hadn't betrayed or abandoned me when circumstances became difficult. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the store that had defined my identity for 18 years, wondering who I was supposed to be now that everything I'd thought permanent had proven ephemeral. The building looked the same as always, but I was no longer part of that routine, no longer one of the people who made the system function. That night, as I sat in my empty house counting and recounting the small stack of bills that represented my entire net worth, something shifted inside me. The desperation began to crystallize into something harder, more focused. I'd spent my entire adult life accommodating other people's needs, adjusting my dreams to fit their limitations, accepting crumbs while pretending they were feast. I walked to my bedroom and knelt beside the bed, reaching underneath to the spot where I'd hidden something years ago, something Ryan had never known about, never thought to look for, never imagined I possessed. My fingers found the small metal box I'd tucked away during the early years of our marriage, back when I'd still believed in planning for emergencies that might require resources he couldn't control or access. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. The metal box was smaller than I remembered, no bigger than a jewelry case, but it felt heavy with possibilities as I lifted it from its hiding place. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed slightly with age, lay my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one thing of real value I'd inherited, the one treasure I'd kept secret even from Ryan. Grandma Rose had given it to me on my 18th birthday, pressing it into my hands with fingers that trembled slightly from arthritis but held firm with intention. "This belonged to my grandmother," she'd whispered, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "It's not about the money it's worth, sweetheart. It's about remembering that you come from strong women who knew how to survive." I'd never worn it during my marriage. Something deep inside had warned me to keep it hidden, to preserve this one connection to my past that Ryan couldn't diminish or control. Now, as I held the lustrous strand up to the lamplight, each pearl seemed to glow with its own inner fire, a reminder of who I'd been before I'd learned to make myself smaller, to fit into someone else's vision of my life. Beneath the necklace lay the other contents of my secret box, documents Ryan had never seen, records he'd never known existed. My original birth certificate, with my maiden name printed in formal script. The deed to a small piece of property my grandfather had left me, just 2 acres of undeveloped land outside the city that I'd never mentioned, because Ryan would have found a way to monetize it, and most importantly, a savings account I'd opened in my maiden name years before I'd met Ryan, one that received automatic deposits from a small inheritance trust my grandparents had established. The account statements showed a balance that made my breath catch in my throat. Not a fortune by Ryan's standards, but enough to change everything. Enough for a fresh start. Enough to prove that while he'd been systematically dismantling my life, I'd been unconsciously preparing for survival. Sitting on my bedroom floor with these documents spread before me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with clarity. This wasn't just about money. This was about remembering who I'd been before I'd learned to apologize for taking up space, before I'd accepted that my dreams were less important than someone else's comfort. I thought about my grandmother Rose, who'd raised 4 children during the Depression after her husband died in a factory accident. She'd taken in laundry to pay the rent, grown vegetables in every patch of available soil, and somehow managed to send all her children to school with clean clothes and full bellies. She'd never remarried, never apologized for her independence, never pretended to be less capable than she was to make others feel more important. A woman who knows her own worth, she used to say while teaching me to embroider on summer afternoons, doesn't need anyone else's permission to claim it. The car became my refuge when the eviction notice expired, and the sheriff's deputies arrived to oversee my removal from the house I'd called home for over a decade. They were professional but firm, explaining that I could take only what I could carry, and that any remaining possessions would be disposed of according to state law. I packed with desperate efficiency, choosing between items that all seemed essential until forced scarcity demanded impossible decisions. Some clothes, but not all. Keeping work-appropriate outfits and weather-appropriate layers while abandoning everything else. A few books that had provided comfort during difficult times. The photo albums Ryan had deemed unworthy of theft, filled with images of relatives who'd passed away and friends who'd drifted out of contact. Everything else became someone else's problem to solve. The kitchen table where I'd paid bills and planned meals would be loaded into a truck and hauled away. The rocking chair where I'd read novels on Sunday afternoons would be broken down and recycled into materials for products I'd never be able to afford. That first night in the car, parked behind a 24-hour laundromat where the security lights provided safety and the constant hum of industrial washers masked the sound of my crying, I discovered depths of despair I hadn't known existed. The back seat of a Honda Civic wasn't designed for human habitation, and my frame couldn't find any position that didn't result in cramped muscles and aching joints. But as the days passed and I learned the rhythms of survival, which gas stations had the cleanest restrooms, which libraries offered free internet access, which coffee shops would allow me to sit for hours nursing a single cup, something unexpected began to happen. The constant noise in my head, the endless loop of self-doubt and apology that had accompanied every decision for years, gradually quieted into something resembling peace. I wasn't comfortable, wasn't secure, wasn't living the life I'd planned. But for the first time in over a decade, every choice I made was entirely my own. No one questioned where I went or how long I stayed. No one criticized my appearance or reminded me of my shortcomings. No one expected me to justify my existence or apologize for my needs. In the public library, surrounded by the gentle hush of people pursuing knowledge and the musty comfort of old books, I began to research things I'd never had time to explore when my life had been consumed with managing someone else's expectations. I read about starting small businesses, about investing modest sums for long-term growth, about women who'd rebuilt their lives after devastating losses. I discovered online communities of people who'd survived financial abuse, who'd escaped marriages that had gradually eroded their sense of self-worth, who'd learned to recognize the difference between love and control. Their stories echoed my own in ways that made me realize how universal my experience had been, how many women had awakened to find themselves living in gilded cages they'd helped to build. In these quiet hours between one crisis and the next, I began to understand that what I'd experienced wasn't personal failure. It was systematic manipulation by someone who'd benefited from keeping me small, confused, and dependent. Ryan hadn't fallen out of love with me. He'd never loved me at all. He'd loved the convenience I provided, The way I'd managed the unglamorous details of his life while asking for nothing in return, except the privilege of serving him. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it felt like liberation. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. One morning, as I sat in my car outside a coffee shop where I'd become a familiar sight to the early shift workers, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was warm, professional, and completely unexpected. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Claire Patterson from New Hope Community Church. We've heard about your situation from one of our volunteers who works at the hospital where you were treated last week. I wondered if you might be interested in learning about some resources we have available for women who are transitioning between housing situations." I'd forgotten about the kind nurse who'd given me a sandwich and spoken about dignity with such conviction. Apparently, she'd remembered me. "We operate a transitional housing program," Claire continued, "and we also provide job placement assistance and financial counseling. I know it might seem overwhelming right now, but sometimes when everything falls apart, it creates space for something better to grow." Something better. The phrase Ryan had used to justify his cruelty turned into an invitation toward hope. As I listened to Claire describe the program, explain the application process, and offer to meet with me that afternoon, I felt the last remnants of my old life finally releasing their grip on my imagination. I wasn't trying to get back what I'd lost anymore. I was preparing to discover what I'd been meant to find all along. The New Hope Community Church sat on a quiet corner in an older part of the city, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained, surrounded by mature trees that provided welcome shade and suggested the kind of permanence I'd lost faith in. A simple sign announced the church's name in letters that had faded but remained legible, and below that, in smaller text, "All are welcome." I hesitated at the entrance, my hand resting on the door handle while I fought the internal voices that insisted I didn't belong among people who had their lives together. I'd never been particularly religious, finding more comfort in practical action than in prayer or theological contemplation. But Claire's sandwich had been real, and her kindness had been genuine, and sometimes faith meant trusting in human goodness rather than divine intervention. The woman who greeted me introduced herself as Judy Martinez, coordinator of the church's assistance programs. She had graying hair pulled back in a practical style and clothing chosen for comfort rather than fashion. Something in her demeanor suggested she understood that healing involved more than just medical treatment. "We don't have a lot of rules," Judy explained as she led me through the facility with obvious pride. "No alcohol or drugs on the premises, no overnight guests, participation in weekly house meetings to discuss any issues that arise. Beyond that, we trust people to manage their own lives while we provide the support they need to get back on their feet." The shelter program operated out of a converted house adjacent to the church building, offering private rooms for up to 8 women at a time. The accommodations were basic but clean, with shared bathroom facilities and a kitchen where residents could prepare their own meals using donated groceries and basic cooking equipment. The room I was assigned was small but private, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a garden where previous residents had planted flowers and vegetables. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and someone had hung encouraging quotations in simple frames, words about perseverance and hope that might have seemed trite under other circumstances, but felt profoundly meaningful to someone who'd begun to doubt whether situations could improve. That first night in an actual bed, between clean sheets, with a locked door between myself and the outside world, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. The simple luxury of horizontal rest, of physical safety, of knowing I wouldn't be woken by police flashlights or the need to move my car before dawn, allowed my body to begin recovering from the trauma of recent events. Over the following days, Judy proved to be more than just an administrator. She became a mentor, teacher, and sometimes surrogate family member who understood that rebuilding a life required more than just providing shelter and meals. She helped me rewrite my resume to emphasize transferable skills rather than just job titles, taught me interview techniques that highlighted my reliability and experience rather than my recent employment gap. 18 years of customer service experience, Judy said, reviewing the updated resume with careful attention. That demonstrates loyalty, patience, communication skills, problem-solving ability. Any employer would be lucky to have someone with your background. The other women in the shelter became an unexpected source of strength and community. Despite coming from different backgrounds and experiencing different types of crisis, we shared an understanding of what it meant to have your life completely disrupted through circumstances largely beyond your control. There was Maria, whose husband's construction accident had left him disabled, and their family unable to afford their rent. Sarah, who'd fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and her 2 young children. Jennifer, whose small business had failed during an economic downturn, taking her savings and her apartment with it. We gathered in the kitchen each evening, sharing simple meals and stories that helped us process our experiences without judgment or comparison. These women had faced their own versions of betrayal and loss, yet somehow they'd retained hope for the future and compassion for each other's struggles. The hardest part, Maria said one night as we cleaned dishes together, isn't losing what you had. It's realizing you were never as secure as you thought you were, that all those things you counted on could disappear so quickly. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The house, the marriage, the job, they'd all felt permanent until they weren't. But sitting in this kitchen with these women, sharing donated groceries and secondhand wisdom, I was beginning to understand that real security came from something more durable than external circumstances. 3 weeks into my stay at New Hope, something unexpected happened. I was checking the job postings on the community computer when an email notification appeared in my personal account. The sender's name made my breath catch in my throat. Morrison. Ryan. My finger hovered over the delete button for a long moment. Part of me wanted to erase his words without reading them, to maintain the peace I'd been slowly building. But a larger part needed to know what he could possibly have to say after everything he'd done. The email was brief, written in the same clinical tone he'd used for the voice message that had started this entire ordeal. Becky, I've been thinking about our situation, and I realize I may have handled things poorly. I'm prepared to offer you a settlement that would help you get back on your feet. Can we meet to discuss this? I think we can find a solution that works for both of us. Ryan. I read the message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of manipulation disguised as conciliation. The careful wording that avoided any admission of wrongdoing. The suggestion that our situation was some kind of mutual misunderstanding rather than his systematic betrayal. The implication that he was being generous by offering me something that was already rightfully mine. But what struck me most was the timing. Why was he reaching out now? What had happened in his new life that made him suddenly concerned about my welfare? The Ryan I knew didn't operate on guilt or conscience. He operated on self-interest and damage control. I shared the email with Judy during our weekly check-in meeting. She read it with the same careful attention she brought to everything, her expression growing more thoughtful with each sentence. What do you think he wants? She asked, setting the printed page aside. I don't know, I admitted, but I know it's not about helping me. Ryan doesn't do anything unless it benefits him somehow. Judy nodded slowly. Have you thought about how you want to respond? The question surprised me. A month ago, I would have immediately started crafting a reply, analyzing every word to avoid triggering his anger or disappointment. I would have been grateful for any contact from him, hopeful that it might lead to reconciliation or at least closure. Now, sitting in this small office decorated with inspirational posters and certificates recognizing the church's community service, I realized I felt something entirely different. Curiosity mixed with caution, but no longer desperation or hope for reconciliation. I think I want to know what he's really after, I said finally. But I also think I want to meet him on my terms, not his. Judy smiled, and I could see approval in her eyes. That sounds like the response of someone who's remembered her own worth. That evening, I crafted my reply with the same care I'd once devoted to managing Ryan's expectations, but with an entirely different purpose. Instead of trying to please or placate, I was establishing boundaries and asserting my own agency. Ryan, I'm willing to meet with you to discuss this settlement you mentioned. However, the meeting will need to take place at a location of my choosing, with a third party present to ensure clarity about any agreements. If you're genuinely interested in resolving our situation fairly, these conditions shouldn't be problematic. Let me know if these terms are acceptable to you. As I hit send, I felt a small thrill of power I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in our entire relationship, I was dictating terms rather than accepting them. I was no longer the desperate woman who would gratefully accept whatever scraps he chose to offer. The response came within hours, and its tone was noticeably different from his initial message. Gone was the casual assumption that I would eagerly accommodate his preferences. Instead, there was a careful formality that suggested he was dealing with someone he no longer felt he could control. Your conditions are acceptable. I suggest we meet at the downtown public library, main branch, Tuesday at 2 p.m. I assume you'll arrange for your third party to be present. Something was definitely happening in Ryan's world that I didn't understand yet. The man who had discarded me via voicemail was now agreeing to meet on my terms, in a public space, with witnesses present. This wasn't the behavior of someone who felt secure in his new circumstances. I began to sense that Tuesday's meeting would reveal more than just his settlement offer. Something had shifted in the balance of power between us, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Tuesday arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn, the kind of day when everything seems sharper and more defined than usual. I arrived at the downtown library 30 minutes early, accompanied by Judy, who had volunteered to serve as my witness and advocate. We chose a table in the main reading room, surrounded by the quiet rustle of pages turning and the soft clicking of keyboards, a public space that felt both safe and dignified. I wore the one professional outfit I'd salvaged from my old life, a navy blazer and matching skirt that I'd paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace. The pearls felt warm against my skin, a tangible reminder of the strength I'd inherited from women who had faced far greater challenges than a manipulative ex-husband. Ryan appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, and I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the confident stride and perfectly groomed appearance that had once made me feel inadequate by comparison. His suit was expensive as always, but something about his posture suggested a man carrying invisible weight. His face was drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. He approached our table with the careful politeness of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, extending his hand to Judy in a gesture that seemed more nervous than courteous. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," he said, settling into the chair across from me. His voice carried none of the casual dismissiveness I'd grown accustomed to during our marriage. This was the tone he reserved for important clients, people whose opinions mattered to his success. "Let's get straight to business," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. "What's this settlement you mentioned?" Ryan shifted in his chair, pulling a manila folder from his briefcase with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "I've prepared documents that would transfer ownership of the house back to you, along with restoration of the joint savings account to its previous balance. There would also be a lump sum payment to cover your lost wages and inconvenience." I stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he'd just offered. Everything he'd taken, everything he'd destroyed, handed back to me as if it were a business transaction rather than compensation for devastating betrayal. "Why?" I asked simply. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He'd prepared for negotiation, for demands, for grateful acceptance. He hadn't prepared for someone who questioned his motives. "I realize I may have acted hastily," he began, falling back on the corporate speak that had always been his refuge when emotions became too complex to manage. "I want to ensure that both parties can move forward in a way that's mutually beneficial." "Ryan," my voice cut through his carefully constructed evasions with quiet authority. "Why are you really here?" Something in his composure cracked, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely vulnerable. The mask of professional competence slipped, revealing the face of a man who'd discovered that getting everything he thought he wanted hadn't brought him the satisfaction he'd expected. "Jessica left me," he said quietly, the admission falling between us like a stone into still water. 3 weeks ago. She said that the way I treated you showed her what kind of man I really was. Her friends had done some research into our divorce, found out about the mortgage payments, the savings account. They convinced her that if I could do that to someone I'd been married to for 12 years, I'd eventually do it to her too. The pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity. The new girlfriend he'd left me for, the woman who matched his future, had discovered the full extent of his betrayal and found it repulsive rather than impressive. His carefully constructed new life had collapsed under the weight of his own cruelty. "She wasn't wrong," I said softly. Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since he'd sat down. "I know that now. I know I handled things badly. I was scared of being trapped in a life that felt too small for what I thought I deserved. But I realize now that I threw away something real, for something that was just an illusion. The words he spoke might have shattered me 6 months ago. The admission of regret, the acknowledgement of my worth, the suggestion that our marriage had been real in ways his new relationship wasn't. It was everything I'd longed to hear during the darkest moments of my abandonment. But sitting in that library, surrounded by the gentle hum of people pursuing knowledge and growth, I felt nothing but a calm sort of pity for the man across from me. He was offering to restore my old life as if that were still what I wanted, as if I hadn't spent the past months discovering who I was when I wasn't constantly adjusting myself to fit his expectations. "You want me to come back?" I said. It wasn't a question. "I want us to try again," he confirmed, reaching across the table as if to take my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond to the gesture either. "I know I hurt you terribly, but we had 12 years together. That has to count for something." "It does count for something," I agreed, and I saw hope flicker across his features. "It taught me what I'm worth, and what I'm not willing to accept anymore." The hope died in his eyes, replaced by confusion, and then the first stirrings of the anger that had always simmered beneath his polished exterior. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that your settlement offer is very generous, and I accept it gratefully. The house, the savings account, the compensation for lost wages, all of that will help me build the life I want to live. But if you're offering it because you expect me to come back to you, then you've misunderstood something fundamental about what's happening here." Judy, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, leaned forward slightly. Her presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in this moment, that I had people in my life now who valued me for who I was, rather than for what I could provide. "I'm not the same woman you left in that grocery store checkout line," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not the woman who would accept your financial scraps while you controlled everything that mattered. I'm not the woman who would pretend to be smaller and less capable so you could feel more important." "Becky, you're being emotional." "No," I interrupted, and the sharpness in my voice silenced him completely. "I'm being clear. For the first time in our entire relationship, I'm being absolutely clear about what I want and what I won't tolerate." Ryan sat back in his chair, his face cycling through expressions I recognized from our marriage. Confusion, frustration, and finally the cold calculation that had always preceded his most cutting remarks. "You think you're better off now?" he asked, his voice taking on the condescending tone he'd used whenever he wanted to remind me of my place. "Living in a charity shelter? Unemployed? Driving that ancient car? You think that's an improvement over what I'm offering you?" The question was designed to shame me, to make me feel small and desperate enough to accept whatever he was willing to give. 6 months ago, it would have worked. 6 months ago, I would have apologized for my ingratitude and begged him to forgive my foolishness. Instead, I smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and completely unafraid. "Yes," I said simply, "I absolutely think I'm better off, because for the first time in 12 years, every decision I make is my own. Every choice reflects what I want, rather than what you think I should want. Every day I wake up knowing that I don't have to earn the right to exist in my own life." I stood up, gathering the settlement documents with hands that remained perfectly steady. "Thank you for this," I said, tapping the folder. "It will make rebuilding much easier. But Ryan, this is goodbye. Not see you later, or let's take some time to think." This is the end of whatever we were to each other. As Judy and I walked toward the library's exit, I heard him call my name once, his voice carrying a note of desperation I'd never heard before. I didn't turn around. Some chapters of life deserve to end with dignity, and turning back would have diminished the moment for both of us. Outside, in the crisp autumn air, Judy linked her arm through mine in a gesture of solidarity and support. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotions the way I'd learned to do during our counseling sessions. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in so long, I feel completely free." 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what was once again my house, but everything about it felt different. The rooms that had echoed with emptiness and abandonment now hummed with quiet purpose and gentle activity. Sunlight streamed through windows I'd hung with curtains chosen for my own taste, rather than someone else's approval, illuminating furniture I'd selected piece by piece from estate sales and consignment shops. The kitchen, where I'd once eaten that heartbreaking dinner of a single egg and stale bread, now filled regularly with the aromas of meals I cooked because I enjoyed cooking, not because someone expected it of me. The refrigerator bore photos held by magnets I'd bought simply because they made me smile. Pictures of my new friends from the shelter, snapshots from weekend trips I'd taken alone to places I'd always wanted to see, images of the small garden I'd planted behind the house where vegetables grew alongside flowers chosen purely for their beauty. The settlement money had covered not just the restoration of what Ryan had stolen, but had also provided enough cushioning for me to be selective about my next steps. Instead of desperately accepting any available position, I'd taken time to consider what kind of work would bring me satisfaction rather than just survival. The job I'd found exceeded my expectations in ways I hadn't thought possible. Mercy General Hospital had been looking for someone to coordinate their patient advocacy program, a role that combined customer service skills with genuine care for people during vulnerable moments. The work paid better than the grocery store ever had, but more importantly, it fed something in my spirit that had been starved for years. Every day I helped patients navigate insurance complications, communicate with medical staff, and find resources for recovery support. I advocated for people who felt voiceless in a complex system, using skills I'd developed through my own recent experience with feeling powerless and overlooked. The irony wasn't lost on me that my greatest professional satisfaction came from helping others reclaim their dignity during times of crisis. My supervisor, Dr. Patricia Reeves, had become both mentor and friend, someone who understood that personal experience with adversity often created the most effective advocates. "You have a gift for making people feel heard," she told me during my 6-month review. "Patients trust you because they sense you understand what it feels like to have your life turned upside down." The women from New Hope remained central to my social world, forming the kind of friendships I'd never experienced during my marriage. Maria had found stable housing and was slowly rebuilding her family's financial security. Sarah had successfully escaped her abusive situation and was raising her children in an environment free from fear. Jennifer had launched a new business venture, this time with partners who shared both the risks and the rewards. We met monthly for dinner, sometimes at restaurants that would have been impossibly expensive during my grocery store days, sometimes in each other's homes where we cooked together and shared stories of our continued healing. These gatherings had become celebrations of resilience, reminders that survival could transform into thriving with patience and mutual support. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah had asked during our most recent gathering, gesturing around my renovated kitchen with its cheerful yellow walls and carefully chosen decorations. The predictability of being married even when it wasn't happy? I'd considered her question seriously, running my finger around the rim of the coffee mug I'd bought because I loved its deep blue glaze, not because it matched some predetermined color scheme. "I miss the illusion of security," I'd answered honestly, "but I don't miss feeling like a guest in my own life." The truth was that I'd discovered forms of security more durable than any I'd experienced during my marriage. Financial independence built on my own skills and choices felt infinitely more stable than prosperity that depended on someone else's goodwill. Friendships based on mutual respect and genuine affection created emotional safety that hadn't existed in a relationship where I'd constantly worried about saying or doing something wrong. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment in ways that made external validation less crucial to my sense of worth. The woman who'd once analyzed every word before speaking, who'd apologized for taking up space or having needs, had been replaced by someone who stated her opinions clearly and stood behind her decisions without requiring approval from anyone else. Ryan's attempts at contact had dwindled over the months following our library meeting. The occasional text message suggesting coffee or a phone call just to check in had eventually stopped entirely when I'd failed to respond to any of them. Judy had helped me understand that engaging with his overtures, even to reject them, would only encourage him to continue believing that persistence might eventually wear down my resolve. The last I'd heard of him was through the social media posts of mutual acquaintances, carefully curated images of a man who appeared to be dating frequently, but never for very long. The comments from his friends carried undertones of concern disguised as humor, suggestions that he might want to settle down again before he got too set in his bachelor ways. I felt no satisfaction in his apparent struggles, but I also felt no desire to rescue him from consequences he'd created through his own choices. On a crisp Saturday morning in early spring, I was working in my garden when I heard a familiar sound, the joyful barking of a dog who'd spotted something interesting. I looked up to see a golden retriever pulling his owner along the sidewalk. his tail wagging with the unrestrained enthusiasm that had once been such a constant part of my daily life. For a moment, my heart clenched with the old grief of losing Max, the companion who'd been taken from me along with everything else I'd valued. But as I watched this unknown dog explore the world with such obvious delight, I realized the emotion I felt wasn't pain anymore. It was appreciation for the joy that animals brought to the world, and perhaps a quiet readiness to consider sharing my life with a pet again when the timing felt right. The garden bed where I knelt was filled with herbs I was growing for the hospital's therapy garden project, plants that would eventually help patients connect with nature during their recovery process. Working with soil and seeds had become a form of meditation, a way of participating in cycles of growth and renewal that put my own transformation into perspective. As I continued planting, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating voice message to this moment of quiet contentment. The path had included more pain than I'd thought I could survive, but it had also revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. I'd learned the difference between being broken and being broken open. One was an ending, the other was a beginning. The afternoon sun warmed my shoulders as I worked, and I found myself humming a song I'd heard on the radio that morning. Something about starting over and finding home in unexpected places. My hands were dirty with rich soil. My back ached pleasantly from physical labor, and my heart felt fuller than it had in years. A car pulled into my driveway, and I looked up to see Judy climbing out of her practical sedan, carrying what appeared to be a small potted plant. She'd taken to bringing me seedlings for my garden, claiming they were extras from the church's community garden project, though I suspected she purchased them specifically to give me excuses to spend time nurturing growing things. "How's the therapy garden coming along?" she asked, settling beside me on the grass with the easy comfort of someone who'd become family by choice rather than obligation. "Slowly but surely," I replied, accepting the small tomato plant she offered and examining its healthy green leaves. "Dr. Reeves thinks we'll be ready to launch the program by midsummer." "And how are you doing?" Judy asked, the question carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd witnessed my journey from despair to healing and understood that recovery was an ongoing process rather than a destination. I paused in my planting to consider her question seriously, taking inventory of my emotional state with the same thoroughness I brought to everything else in my carefully reconstructed life. The morning had brought news that my divorce was officially finalized, closing the legal chapter of my marriage with paperwork that felt more administrative than emotional. I'd received a promotion at work, recognition that my contributions were valued by people who understood their worth. And tonight, I was meeting friends for dinner at a restaurant I'd chosen simply because I wanted to try their spring menu. "Whole," I said finally, surprising myself with the word, but recognizing its truth the moment I spoke it. For the first time in so long, I feel completely whole. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. In the quiet that followed my words, with dirt under my fingernails and sunlight on my face, I understood that I'd found something far more valuable than everything I'd lost. I'd found myself.